I'd like to greet everyone who is here with us this evening or who is here with us online for this exceptional opportunity for you to engage with a figure who has played a major role, not only in his country's recent political history, but also in the world that you are more familiar with as the head of a leading think tank on international affairs registered in Belgrade and in New York. Vuk Jeremic is a former foreign minister of Serbia. We actually indirectly worked together at a phase when I was in charge of enlargement in the European Commission. So it's a great pleasure to welcome you again after so long. And he's editor of a journal, Horizons, Journal of International Relations and Sustainable Development. As foreign minister and subsequently occupied a number of very important positions, including president of the United Nations General Assembly, as well as leading roles in the Council of Europe and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. He has a long list of achievements. I won't recite them all to you. They're available on our think tank, but a very impressive political and academic record. This evening, we're going to be talking about the Balkans and the role of great power politics in the Balkans, but also Mr. Jeremic has told me that he's open to discussing wider geopolitical issues that you might like to raise. So after an introduction, I will open up to questions, both to those of you here and those of you online. Those who are in line, please pose your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and I will filter your questions into the dialogue as we go forward. So welcome, Vuk. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for this kind introduction. Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be for the first time in Bologna, home to a historical university campus, and also here at Johns Hopkins. It's a pleasure to talk about this topic. I've been kind of living through this topic for good 20, maybe 25 years now. I am still involved in my country's public affairs, but I'll try and be more academic than political, because we are in an academic setting. So talking about the Balkans, which is a very complicated place, one has to think like where to start from. And just like in nature, we're trying, when you try to understand something complex, in nature, which you don't understand so easily, you go back to the fundamental forces and first principles. You go back to physics and chemistry and biology, trying to figure out what's going on. Well, in geopolitics, when you want to understand something complicated, you then go to the fundamental forces, which are history and geography, and important corollary of history and geography, which is culture. History in general, in my view, is actually a story of relations between the great actors, between the great powers. And history of small nations, I come from a small nation. They're stories which are sometimes glorious and sometimes tragic, but they're all footnotes in the context of bigger context of history, which is the history of relations between the great powers. And if one looks at the Balkans, and if one looks at the broader geography of that area of Europe, one recognizes that the Balkans has always been crucial to those who had the ambition of projecting power or goods or people from the north to the south, or from the south to the north. It was important for Alexander the Great, it was important for the Ottomans who were going to the north to try and occupy Vienna. It was crucial to the Germans several times in 2 world wars. It was important for the Soviets. It is still very much important for those who have the ambition either to pass or to block someone from passing. So the Balkans has historically been either the highway of empires or the buffer of empires. So you can historically think of a pattern in which somebody has the ambition to pass and somebody else has the ambition to block him off. And I think that such is the state of affairs in the Balkans today, perhaps not advertently, but if one goes back to 2015 and the huge refugee crisis, the migrants crisis of Europe, which some people call the 9/11 of Europe, which shaped the European politics in so many ways. Again, the Balkans, the part that is still not integrated in the European or Euro-Atlantic and full structures, is in a way a buffer towards something that someone considers a danger. In this particular case, Europe considers a danger emanating out of its southwest. So how we've gotten to here, it's actually a story and the results of a millennia, not just hundreds of years, but millennia of conflicts between Europe and the Middle East. And it has been since, say, the 15th century, it has been a 3-way struggle between the Eastern Christianity, the Western Christianity, and Islam. And whilst theology didn't really drive the great powers, it ended up defining the smaller nations. So if you talk about Eastern Orthodoxy and Serbs, or Catholicism and Croats and Slovenians, for instance, or Bosniaks and Islam, it's actually a result of this 3-way, hundreds of years of frictions and sometimes conflicts between the great powers. Balkans is a place that usually seems to be on the verge of a conflict. It doesn't happen all that often, but when it happens, it's usually with devastating effects. So what we currently have in the Balkans, which is some kind of a void, some kind of an interruption of the European enlargement process, which maybe 10 years ago when you and I worked together was thought to be a foregone conclusion, like the thing that is going to happen and in our lifetime. It doesn't seem so. It doesn't look like it is going to be completed anytime soon. Because in the broader context and the broader geography, the world has fallen into what I call a geopolitical recession. So when you say recession, one usually thinks of an economy, because in economy, processes come in cycles. There are cycles of booms and cycles of bust. And they're easier to spot, they're easier to quantify. They tend to last for a few years. And they come and go one after another. Well, the same thing applies, in my opinion, to geopolitics. The only difference is that the geopolitical cycles are far longer. They usually take decades. And these are the cycles when there's little international cooperation, when there's little international trust, when multilateral institutions are actually struggling to deliver or even survive. Whereas in the good days and the geopolitical cycles of boom, there are treaties, there's dynamism, there's optimism. And I remember only 5 years ago, I actually ran for the post of Secretary General of the United Nations. And those were the good years of multilateralism. Actually, 2015 was considered to be the peak of multilateralism for sure in our century, in the 21st century. That was the year when there was a Paris Climate Treaty, and there was a year when the JCPO was signed, and the Sustainable Development Goals were agreed on by the General Assembly of the United Nations. And despite difficulties, of course, the Syrian war was going on, and there were other theaters of frictions, but generally, there was a very hopeful view of how the world will continue working together and more closely so. And that was reflected in the race for Secretary General. There were 13 of us running in the race, and there were dynamic debates, even public debates between us candidates. And there were several rounds of voting, and the world was following what was going on, and the newspapers were writing about this. And today, the world is quite different when it comes to international cooperation. The United Nations, for instance, is a much less dynamic place. It's a completely, it's a place of stalemate. It's very, very difficult to imagine something being pushed through the United Nations. And this is not the only international organization that is struggling. Now, in such a context, a place like the Balkans, theater like the Balkans, which has traditionally been one of the more complex, one of the more intricate places where the big powers work or confront each other, it ended up being stuck in a limbo. So, as I said 10 years ago, we thought that by now, by this year, we're all going to be members of the European Union. And now, I didn't think that this is going to happen. I don't want to dwell too deep into history, but this three-way struggle between the East, the West, and the Southeast, and the names of those actors changed. When you spoke about the West a couple of 100 years ago, you thought Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then it's the United States of America or the European Union, or both the United States and the European Union, NATO maybe. The East being the Russian Empire, and then the Soviet Union, and these days the Russian Federation again. And then in the Southeast, you had the Ottoman Empire, now the Republic of Turkey, which is having a number of Ottoman characteristics in its outlook, at least, or its projected policies around the region. But you had those three constantly there. The recent addition to the equation, and this is perhaps the only one fundamental change if one looks back at history and today's moment, is the entrance of China into the region. This is the very first time in history that China can be counted as a factor in the Balkans. And although in the last 18 months, this had actually slowed down considerably, because of COVID and because of China's own regrouping and political developments at home, in which they're trying to focus and be far more strategic about their closer neighborhood rather than overstretching into faraway geographies like the Balkans. But they did come in as a very significant economic actor, and especially in the aftermath of the European financial crisis. Well, the global financial crisis, but the European crisis, the Greek crisis, the European economic crisis in particular, when China swiftly moved in, started privatizing ports in Greece, started building roads around the region, and that ended up being a significant injection of cash. And we can debate the long-term consequences of that in terms of potential death threats and traps and the like. But that was until a couple of years ago a fundamental addition. Now it's not as significant. Their influence is not political; it is economic. But then again, in a bizarre way, the European influence in the Balkans has also been pushed mainly to the economic realm. Now, is it a sign of a wider European weakness, the geopolitical weakness of Europe, the Europe punching below its weight geopolitically, despite its economic size and the size of its population? We can debate that too. But when it comes to politics, when it comes to security, when it comes to these geopolitical topics, both Europe and China are, I would say, in the backseat if you compare it to the United States, the Russian Federation, and also, believe it or not, Turkey. Turkey, with its great influence, especially in certain parts of the Balkans, where the Muslim population is dominant. Bosnia, first and foremost, but there are other parts of the Balkans where Turkey is having considerable sway in security terms, in cultural terms, but also in geopolitical terms. So the future is very uncertain, both short-term future and mid-term future. It'd be crazy to talk about the long-term future inside the geopolitical recession, if you ask me. But this limbo and this heightened interest of great powers struggling more and more directly so in this geopolitical recession had its institutional and political repercussions on the countries of the Balkans themselves. So institutions have weakened considerably. Organized crime shot up considerably. There was democratic backsliding. If you look at the rankings that are composed by specialized institutions, both governmental institutions like the European Union and the European Parliament, but also independent think tanks like the Freedom House, Reporters Without Borders, and the like, we have unfortunately witnessed significant backsliding in most areas where measurements are taken. Freedom of media, democratic freedoms in general, and so on and so forth. That actually makes us slide back in this, although almost completely stalled European process. So getting back on the European path, it's going to be very difficult, not just because of these geopolitical recession and the European Union not being able to discuss enlargement without much hindrance, and because of other problems that the European Union is facing, but also because we as countries of the Western Balkans are being qualified less and less as we move into the future, and not more and more. So I'm going to end this opening at this not so terribly hopeful note, but this is the realistic snapshot of this moment. I can't really think of a place in the world that for which one can say, oh, we are having the best time of our lives in recent memory. But in the Balkans, this is certainly not the heyday, not in our lifetime. So this is my opening. And I thought you said 20 minutes.
That's perfect. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think this was a very comprehensive overview, a very realistic view, a view that gives us much pause for thought. I can see that there are many questions, both here in the room and online. I have some of my own, but I will restrain them and rather give the floor to the students, either online. Please put your questions into the QA box, or those present. Please introduce yourself and ask your question or make your comment.
Hi, how are you? Thank you so much for visiting. My name is
Please
Anya.
speak up.
This is how I speak. My name is Anya, international relations student here at Johns Hopkins. My question is in regards to Open Balkan initiative. Are we looking more into, looking at the United States of America as far as like a model or, opening trade? Or are we looking at China, Russia, or are we going to, in a sense, divert back to maybe something like we see in Afghanistan?
Could I ask you, for the sake of others present, if you just say a couple of words to explain to people here what the Open Balkans initiative involves?
Yeah, I was about to say, if everybody knows what the Open Balkans is, I know, but
I think you would do a better job at explaining it, please,
Especially
if it's the first time for students.
Okay.
well, I actually don't know if I'd be the best person to explain this to the people who hear it for the first time, who hear about this concept for the first time. Because the Open Balkans was like something that was signed between some countries of the Western Balkans with the aim, or at least with the claim, that the aim is to enhance freedom of transport, freedom of movement in general, and closer economic integration between some of the countries of the Western Balkans. Not everybody signed up to it, but it's first and foremost Serbia, Northern Macedonia, and Albania. Now, when I say Open Balkans is something, the reason why I say something is that nobody really knows what it is. It has not passed any transparent procedure. When you start making treaties, when you start making, economic zones, you're supposed to have a serious discussion followed by legislation. You get to discuss things in parliament, and you get to debate what are the pros and cons of creating a certain economic space. It took Europe decades to evolve from the steel and coal to where it is right now. Those three leaders, the leaders of Serbia, Northern Macedonia, and Albania, they met one day and they announced that we're gonna have this. And at least in Serbia, I don't think that it was too much different in Northern Macedonia and Albania. But in Serbia, it was a complete, well, I'm not going to say complete shock, but there is very little transparency as to what it actually means. What are the security repercussions? What are the immigration repercussions? What are the migration repercussions? What are the defense repercussions of this? The one thing that I'm sure about is that organized crime in the Balkans is very much supportive of the Open Balkans initiative. And, the governments in the Western Balkans, they do have a very, I'd say, strong attitude towards organized crime, and I don't mean combating it. So there are a number of very, very deep concerns with regard to it. Of course, in principle, if we would love to see Balkans as a part of the European family, to join the European Union one day, yes, of course, the freedom of movement, the freedom of services and all that, yes, sure. but one knows how it's done in a democracy. It's got to be done in a very transparent way. And unfortunately, I'm not prepared to say that this was the case with the Open Balkans. I must admit that I did not understand the second part of the question, the Russia-China part. So if you could repeat that part of the question.
Like just the economic model.
Economic model?
Yeah. Like, are we looking more at the United States or China?
So I'm.
It's quite.
Do you mean with regard to this initiative or more generally?
I don't think it had to do with any model that you had in mind. It wasn't the Russian, it wasn't the Chinese, it wasn't the American model. I'm afraid it was more driven by other considerations than how to expedite flow of goods.
I might just add a brief word, and that is, I mean, I think that Mr. Jeremic's assessment is very accurate, you know, that it was something a little bit pulled out of the hat, and in terms of implementation, there are many, many questions. But there is a pattern to this. You know, it was to some extent described as a sort of mini Schengen, at least in aspiration. And, you know, when the EU has run into difficulties in the enlargement process with different, or in relations with different countries over the years, one of its reflexes is to say, well, show us first that you can cooperate amongst yourselves. And then later on, you know, we can move ahead with this process. They tried that in Northern Africa, you know, with encouraging the countries to establish a free trade area in the Maghreb. And it was in Central Europe as well before accession, Central European Free Trade Area. So maybe, I mean, the parties involved sort of thought that, well, look, the accession process is so slow. Let's show that we can go ahead anyway amongst ourselves. And perhaps with the thought somewhere in the back of their minds that indirectly this might contribute, you know, to moving closer towards Europe by showing this will. But turning this intention into a reality, I think is going to be rather difficult. Yes, Professor Allen, please. We'll come to you just a second.
Thank you. I have a slightly complicated question, so I'm sure I'll muddle it. But I was struck by your suggestion of geopolitical sort of boom and bust or expansion and recession. I think it's probably very accurate. I'm wondering if you think back to the times of a sort of optimistic expansion, if there's something you see in the Balkans or in Eastern Europe generally of possible overreach. I mean, I don't know, you know, the part of the expansive phase arguably was the Kosovo War. And I will say I was in favor of the Kosovo War, but you also, I'm well aware, not only in Serbia perhaps, but in Russia, the narrative of what that meant in terms of NATO's expansionary, I mean, I don't know what to use, but the boom part of sort of geopolitical optimism from NATO's perspective. It's just a very different narrative in Russia. And now you see the Russian narrative really being pushed back on. So that was a complicated question, but I think you see what I'm driving at. My I guess a side question is, well, a related question is, you know, in the context of what's happening in Ukraine right now, you know, do we have to basically cooperate with Russia in places like Ukraine, but particularly in the Balkans as well? And does that suggest limits on, from a Western point of view, the expansionary impulse?
Well, it was a very complicated question, but I did follow your line of thought because it's been my life for the past 20 years. Speaking about opposing narratives first. Everybody knows by now that the idea of the end of history that was coined by Fukuyama at the end of the Cold War. Most people now know that this wasn't really a very realistic proposal. History never actually ends. I think that there's another phrase that is, with time, going to become more and more obvious that it's questionable. And this is the phrase, being on the right side of history. Being on the right side of history is a very bold statement, bold notion. And usually there are different ways in which history is interpreted. In the Balkans in particular, what happened in the First World War? How did it start to begin with? And then how did the First World War lead to the second, not just in the Balkans, but in general, and what it meant, the fall of the Soviet Union, with Putin saying this is the biggest catastrophe of the 20th century, and other people obviously having a very different point of view in this regard. The intervention in Kosovo and what it really brought and what it meant for the geopolitical equation. Back in 1999, Russia wasn't really an actor. It was a very inactive actor. I mean, Russia has never been absent from the Balkans for the past 500 years, but there are like cycles when Russia was more present or less present. And the 90s was the time when they weren't really that much engaged and active in the Balkans. But then the Kosovo War and what happened after the Kosovo War with the unilateral declaration of independence and how it played out in the world diplomatic arena, first and foremost the United Nations, but also around the world in terms of who recognizes Kosovo and who doesn't. It actually opened the way for a surge or a renaissance of Russian influence in the Balkans. It perhaps wasn't so obvious that this was going to be the outcome back in 1999, but it was. And right now, I think that that Bosnia and the intricacies of Bosnia, as well as this insolvable issue, at least in diplomatic terms and statehood terms, of Kosovo, made up for a strong influence of Russia in particular in the Balkans. China too, as a matter of fact. One of the reasons why China is not terribly unpopular, as a matter of fact, China is popular in Serbia, is that China takes a very strong position in the UN Security Council when it comes to Kosovo. And it cost them very little to say "niet" or to say no. I don't know how you say no in Mandarin, but you get the point. So do you have to cooperate? Do we have to cooperate in the region, or the big powers, do they have to cooperate? Well, my opinion is that the general answer to that is a yes. Because without international cooperation, one can hardly imagine solutions to what humanity is facing in the 21st century, especially when it comes to climate, when it comes to cyber, when it comes to all the issues that are innate to the problems of humanity in the 21st century. So is that possible? Well, it's very difficult when there is a geopolitical recession, because these are, I would say, negative cycles where politics becomes almost impossible. How to break out of the negative spiral, immense spiral. I look at China and America, look at their respective political calendars. In Russia, there is a different notion of political calendar than in a democratic country. But right now, it's actually not politically feasible to come across as a champion of working together with the other side being Russia or the other side being China. I mean, how can you win an election in the United States, for instance, if you want to start championing engagement? Difficult. Situation in Russia is also similar. Situation in China has become such that although they don't have elections and the like, but their internal political dynamics is such that the leadership in China will find it right now very, very hard to step back from the nationalist rhetoric with regard to Taiwan, with regard to so many other issues. So my answer, do we have to work? Yes. Is that realistic short term? I'm afraid no, not for the time being. What is it going to take us to get again into the cooperation mode? Usually disasters do. Disasters lead actors into say, hey, let's work together. And I was really hoping that COVID-19 was going to be one such disaster. Unfortunately, proved not to be the case. That's very disappointing because can you think of a better reason that the world start working together, like we're fighting a virus that is killing everybody? No, it was unfortunately, it actually accelerated the negative trends that pre-existed. So I'm not prepared to bet when is that going to happen.
That's, if I may say, a very good segue into two questions from participants online. From Jovana Nikolic, who's at the University of Belgrade, and Professor David Elwood, who teaches here, who's in Torino at the moment.
David Elwood of Harvard Kennedy School?
He is in Turin and has taught in Turin and in Bologna and elsewhere.
Because David Elwood was my dean at the Kennedy School. Maybe it's his just namesake.
Don't believe so,
No,
but
not that one.
We'll ask him.
Sure.
So what they are very much picking up on your last remarks, because both are asking about the impact of COVID on great power relations in the Balkans. How has that played itself out? And Professor Elwood is asking in particular about, whatever happened to vaccine diplomacy. There was a moment in which it seemed as though this was playing a crucial role, and Russia, China, and the EU were to some extent competing to see who would be the good guys who were coming to the assistance of Serbia and other countries in the region. And much was made of this, and then it kind of faded away. So what is the enduring impact, if any, of the epidemic in the Balkans and its relation to great power involvement in the region?
I think that the general, the one, I'd say the predominant outcome of COVID was the impact, if you will, was the acceleration of the already existing trends. So COVID didn't change things. COVID didn't change the direction where things were going. It just made things move inside 2-year window that would have otherwise taken 5 to 10 years. And it doesn't apply only to the Balkans. I think it's in general. So at the beginning, the vaccine diplomacy was much debated. And then in the Balkans, it stopped to matter because in the Balkans, people refused to get vaccinated. So that's very unfortunate in my opinion, but we have amongst the lowest vaccination rates. We at some point had abundance of vaccines, especially in Serbia. But then, people refused to take jabs. And at the beginning, it was there was a very early advantage of China, especially in Serbia, because we received massive amounts of Sinopharm vaccines. Later on, it turned out that we were essentially the third stage testing country for the Sinopharm. Thank God it worked well. It proved to be a reasonably good vaccine. I got it. My family got it. That was the only vaccine that was available at that time, and we took it. It tells you a little bit about how Serbia is run. The fact that without the public knowledge that this was going to be essentially a testing stage, the country ended up vaccinated with this. As I said, like, thank God it worked out well. And at the beginning, it was a big boost for Chinese soft power in Serbia, and by extension to the Balkans, because Serbia didn't know what to do with all these vaccines, and then started, giving them out to Northern Macedonia and Bosnia and other countries of the region. But I think it's gone. After having accelerated the trends, especially when it comes to democratic/undemocratic governance, these trends have been accelerated. We right now have a very fierce autocracy, for example, in Serbia. If it weren't for COVID, it would have taken us 5 years to get where we are right now, and we are where we are now as a result of COVID. But apart from that quickening, I don't see further, more lasting effects.
We have some more questions both here and online, but just before coming to you, a follow-up question, because you used the term soft power, and the Europeans use the notion of soft power very much as one of the instruments that they are able to deploy in influencing others around the world. And it's a relatively new notion that China and Russia also aspire to exercising soft power. And the Balkans are often cited as a region in which this is the case. You mentioned China in the context of vaccines. There's also the very large Confucius Institute being built. And Russia may be ethno-nationalism and energy. But do you think the concept of soft power is the right one, or is a useful concept for thinking about how the great powers compete in your region?
I think that in the time of geopolitical recession, you can't successfully exercise soft power without having at least a little bit of hard power to back it up. Geopolitical recessions are the times when hard power counts far more than soft power. I mean, soft power is good, and soft power helps. But in the better times, it was all about a soft power. European Union has never been a hard power. I mean, not the hard power in the sense of the United States or the Russian Federation, but it mattered far less back then when we were negotiating the enlargement. But nobody was noticing it. It was just like the soft power in Europe, the visa-free travel, the education programs that would get you, through Erasmus and other programs. I apologize. Lost my mask. So right now, hard power counts a little bit more than before. So soft power is not gone. Soft power is not gone. And when it comes to Russia, it's deep, and it's to do with the culture and religion. Religion first and foremost, building churches, Orthodox churches, and language, and so on and so forth. Not just, but the ultimate soft power in Serbia, when it comes to Russia and China, are the vetoes in the Security Council that do not allow for Kosovo to become a member of the United Nations. That's what makes them really popular.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's really soft power. Professor Elwood points out that soft power ultimately is the attractiveness of one's political and social system and the desire of others to copy, to emulate your system. And if one defines soft power in those terms, even though some people in the Balkans may perhaps be impressed by the efforts being made on their behalf, as they might see it, by China or by Russia. I'm not sure how many of them wish to emulate China and Russia in terms of way of life and what
That's
they
one
would
way
like
of
to
looking
see.
at it.
But
That's a legitimate way of looking at it, and probably a far more superior theoretical definition. I completely agree with Professor Elwood. But soft power can also be defined in terms of let's run a poll in a country, like which is your favorite foreign nation? And then Russia scores 60 and China 27, and then others score less. That's also one way of looking at like success of soft power overtures. But when it comes, of course, to the political systems and the like, yeah, I mean, I would certainly find other political systems far more attractive. But in our country, we have a almost complete, as I said, autocracy, hybrid regime, dictatorship, and they're like doing well in the elections.
yeah, yeah,
So
it's alarming.
yeah.
Now, you've been very patient. Would you like to come in? And then we have some other questions from.
So I'm Vincenzo, International Affairs Program. Thank you for your very insightful intervention tonight. I have a very direct and controversial question, which I think was addressed actually throughout your intervention, but will there ever exist the condition to see Kosovo recognized by Serbia in a reasonable amount of time in the future?
It's a very short answer. We can debate why. But for Serbia, Kosovo is not territory. It's not something that can be only explained in geographical terms. It's not even something that can be explained in constitutional terms. I mean, there aren't too many countries in the world that would gladly accept that part of its territory decides to unilaterally succeed. I mean, look at Spain and look at other countries around the world. It would be very, very difficult, especially inside a democratic system, to think about being able to accept such an outcome. But it's not just the constitutional necessity. It's not just the geography. It's not just the security terms. It is far more to do with identity. And there are actually three pillars. I mean, every nation has its elements that define them. And in Serbia, one of the most powerful elements is the Kosovo myth, is the myth of actually the entire nation sacrificing in a battle in order to keep its faith and in order to keep its identity. And of course, the full historical record doesn't really correspond to the myth. Like most myths are not exactly relating directly to historical records. But such is the significance of Kosovo for the Serbian national identity, not uncorrelated to the Serbian Orthodox Church. So Serbian Orthodox Church and the Kosovo myth are hand in hand in terms of defining the Serbian nation in this context of this 500, 600, 700, 800 years struggle between the geopolitical powers of different religious disposition that ended up defining Serbs as Orthodox Christians. And this Russia angle to it is not unrelated to this Eastern Orthodoxy commonality between us. Same goes for Greece. I mean, Greece is not really a geopolitical actor of the same order as Russia and others, but Greece is also very strongly related to Serbia, very strongly supportive of Serbia's position in Kosovo, for instance, unlike Turkey, that is very, very supportive of Kosovo's unilateral declaration of independence and of Albanians in general. Again, going back to these centuries of history. You know, I know it's very complicated when you dive into such a territory with its surplus of history. But such is the Levant and such is the Middle East, Iraq, places which have very complicated fabrics of society and religion. And when you poke something, unless you really, really understand what's behind and what's below, you never know what's going to come out. For Serbia, Kosovo is one of the most sensitive and the neuralgic spots you can ever touch. And it wasn't touched, it was just pierced. And I think that we are gonna, many years and decades, in my opinion, are gonna pass before one can sit down and have a discussion rather than the answer that I gave at the beginning to your question.
Okay, there are many, thank you very much for that answer. Of course, this is a question that one could spend the whole evening on, and there are many different points of view that could be evoked, but sure. I know that there are other questions too. So let us, I think you were the next person to raise your hand, please.
Hi, my name is Faith. I'm a Master's in International Affairs student. Sorry, I'll be louder. So you kind of spoke about your own and broader changes in perceptions about the timeline of EU accession and kind of how this has impacted the EU political influence within the region. And so while there are points of dialogue through things like the accession process itself and the EU Western Balkans summit, I was wondering, is there any action you'd like to see on the part of the EU to kind of provide that reassurance towards the region's future in the EU itself?
I didn't understand quite well because probably the mask.
Yeah, the mask is a little.
Sorry about that.
No. So just generally, there's points of dialogue already between the EU and the region through things like the EU Western Balkans Summit, the accession process itself. So is there any action that you'd like to see on the part of the EU to kind of provide that reassurance that a future in the EU is possible?
It's a very good question. It's a very good question. I think it's a fundamental question. I think that the accession process actually lost its credibility. And that the one worst thing that they could do is to come up with the EU Western Balkans fake. Let's pretend that the accession is not completely put on hold. I think the lack of sincerity is killing the prospect of the countries of the Western Balkans continuing to reform so that they start looking like modern European countries. When the accession process was alive and credible, and I remember such times, they kind of ended with Croatia's accession. Croatia's accession was very real. But then after that, it kind of slowed down and then it ended up being completely fake. The European Union, unfortunately, decided not to be honest about it. So the EU is pretending that it's really taking the enlargement process seriously. And the Balkan countries are pretending that they are engaged in reforms that are part of the accession process. That ended up having, it resulted in establishment of dictatorships or hybrid regimes. Let me not use the word. Dictatorship is perhaps too hard a word. My opinion is that Serbia, at least, you can call it dictatorship, but let's use the formal definition, which is hybrid regime. I mean, hybrid regimes, they don't accede to the EU. We should be, in my opinion, more honest with each other. I mean, the Europeans should come and tell us straight to our face, like, look at these Hungarians and Poles. I mean, what would Serbs and Bosnians do if we let them in? That kind of honesty. But let's find a way, let's find a model in which we can engage, in which we can incentivize the countries of the Western Balkans to continue with the stalled reforms, so that one day they start looking like a modern European country. And then it doesn't really matter if you're a member or not. Maybe the doors of membership open in 10 years from now. But if they don't, it's not going to be a tragedy. If we in the Balkans had managed in the meantime to reform ourselves so that there is not much difference between, say, Serbia and Slovenia. I would love to find a way to incentivize Serbia and Montenegro, Bosnia, and others to look more like Slovenia and not less like Slovenia as the time goes by. But if you're going to completely ignore the fact that there is a precipitation in democratic standards. I mean, 2 days ago, look at this. There was an outrageous phone call by Charles Michel to President Vučić of Serbia, in which Charles Michel congratulated Vučić on successful steps towards acceding to the European Union. I mean, nothing could be further away from truth than this. And this guy, of course, enjoys this. He realized that if he continues just paying lip service so that Brussels can tick the box, he can go on doing whatever he wants. So, honesty, more honesty. Let's become more honest partners so we can make up for the inability to make concrete administrative steps, which are impossible for political reasons right now.
I'm resisting very strongly the tendency to put back my old hat, which I haven't worn for 10 years now, and respond on that. Because I understand exactly what you're saying. And this is the kind of discussion that we've had for many, many years. And it's true that there are these kind of mutual misperceptions and distrust. And, you know, the way you put it, it's, of course, a variation of that old sort of Soviet joke, you know, about we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us and so on, right? So, you know, we pretend that we want the Western Balkans to join the EU and you pretend to reform and so on. I understand that. But the thing that I find, well, two things. First of all, let's say if you compare the accession process with the Western Balkans, even today, and even acknowledging the enlargement fatigue in the member states and all of that, the member states seem to be very concerned to keep the process alive. And there are very strong geopolitical and economic interests, particularly in Germany, in Austria, in Greece, in Italy, the countries closest to the Western Balkans, who really feel a national interest in bringing these countries closer to the EU. They really don't want to give up on it, as virtually de facto they've given up on it in the case of Turkey. The other comment and genuine perplexity in my mind is why it takes the EU to provide incentives in order for the reform process to go ahead. I mean, why shouldn't modernization, strengthening of democracy and all of that go ahead because the people of Serbia and the people themselves want it, and that they have representatives and governments that want it too? I mean, can that really be put at the door of the EU if this process slows down?
So you said, like, the countries of the EU, they seem to be keen to keep the process alive. And my question is to that comment, why? It's because they're afraid that if the spade is called a spade, oh my God, Russia and others are going to move in. So we better keep pretending that we pay you and you keep pretending that you work. But I think that the credibility is being lost just by that. There was a humongous pressure and they won inside the European Council and then the European Commission that cluster, now you don't have chapters, you have clusters in the accession process, is open to Serbia in the last session. In the year of most manifest and unambiguous precipitation in all democratic standards. They opened up the environment at the time when environment is becoming perhaps the only issue that is unmanageable to the dictatorship of the Serbian regime. So the European Union became the laughing stock at best. I say at best because a lot of people, especially those who are emotional about joining Europe, are finding themselves struck, deeply disappointed by this. I said to the European ambassador to Belgrade a month ago, I said, like, Mr. Ambassador, I mean, you and I, we don't need to talk about what's going on in Serbia. We know this very well. And I know that you are going to, as the European Union, you are going to open clusters. He said, oh, this is not known. We still don't know. I said, well, come on, Mr. Ambassador, everybody knows you're going to do that. Can I just ask you for one question? Can you ask nobody in Brussels to come and pay us a visit? Because if they do, this is going to be abused by the current regime. Like the parting visit of Chancellor Merkel was completely abused by the ruling regime. So that at the time when they're doing egregious violations of human rights and freedoms of media, for instance, amongst other things, they're coming across as being hugged and supported by the Western leaders. Yesterday, I was in Paris. I was giving a briefing at IFRI, the French Institute of Foreign Relations. And I said, like, I know it's very attractive when Serbia provides you with a good reason or not to let others join, anybody join the European Union, because France is one of the biggest obstacles, as we know. By the way, Northern Macedonia was a dramatic example. When Northern Macedonia changed their name, made a absolutely unimaginable concession in order to unblock its European process, France said no. And then the second time around, it wasn't France, but it was Bulgaria that came up with a, I'm not going to call anything cultural silly, because it was to do with the culture and language and so on and so forth, but catastrophic for the credibility. Because, you know, you turn to the Northern Macedonians and you say, like, I mean, we really tried hard, and then the Bulgarians blocked us. Does anybody want to tell us that, say, you know, giving a different answer to your question on Kosovo would accelerate our European prospect? Well, after Northern Macedonia, it's kind of very, very difficult to argue in this direction. And the other question was also very fundamental. Why would we not aspire, you know, on our own? Well, it is difficult to show such aspirations when you have a rule, when you have a regime in Serbia that kind of cripples economic activity, both at the personal level and at the collective level, to all those who do not show loyalty to it. It is compulsory to vote for the ruling party in Serbia. If you are employed in the public sector, you got to prove that you had voted, you and your family. So when we tried to do something about it, when we tried to show our dissatisfaction, we boycotted the elections because the elections were a sham. And then the Europeans said, like, no, you you have to go and be part of these elections. We said, well, are you going to come and be monitors? Sorry, we can't because of COVID. Like, yes, there are aspirations, and some of us are fighting very, very hard to make our countries, to make our respective countries functional democracies. But it is difficult when you live in a hybrid regime that is part Belarus, part Hungary, part Turkey. And this is what Serbia is.
I think you founded a new political movement. I mean, do you think that discontent with the regime, as you've described it, could lead to eventually a democratic revival and people seeing that it's not heading anywhere that's going to improve their living standards, their personal freedom, and that they might then think again, and that new political movements might have a chance to revive the country?
I do, and I think that we are going to have such chance as early as next month. Well, actually, in April. In April, we have elections in Serbia, and it's a super Sunday. It's a presidential election and parliamentary election, and very interestingly, elections for the city hall of Belgrade. And this is where the hopes are highest, in the city hall elections, and there is actually a chance that we could destabilize this hybrid regime by winning an election. And I think that winning the election in Belgrade, when I say winning an election, please don't think that I mean winning more votes. It actually means declaring victory on Sunday like they will, and then going to the streets, and then after hopefully just demonstrations and nothing more that will last for weeks, then they concede. It's not like, oh my God, you had more votes, so congratulations, now you can, here are the keys to the office. It's not going to happen in Serbia. But the result can be such, and the violations of the electoral process on the day of the election can be such that it yields a street movement that may lead to a change of government. The last time around when these guys were in office, and I would remind you, these are the guys who were in office until the year 2000. Milosevic is gone, but everybody else is still there, starting with Vučić. They did not lose the election and just go. It required a bit more. So I think we are gonna do a bit more, starting with the Belgrade victory on April 3. And then this regime's nature is such that, unlike Hungary and Turkey, who survived the loss of Budapest and Istanbul and Ankara, this regime is not going to be able to survive it.
It's very interesting to see whether in these difficult situations where you do have some state capture, whether the local level can be the path back to some more, as in the case of Turkey, it might well work out that way. We have a number of other people who have been patient and waiting to ask you questions. Yes, Eleanor.
Yes, thank you for this very, very interesting presentation. So I think I already know the answer to this question, but I'm just going to ask it anyways. What is your insight on the 2020 Commission revised methodology? That was my first question. But again, I'm already expecting a certain answer. And what do you think the EU should do to bring back the political and geopolitical in its relationship with Western Balkan countries on a par with, and hopefully beyond, the economic relationship?
I mean, the revised methodology was just like formalizing the impossibility of making a significant progress in the accession process proper. And what to do to bring back geopolitical clout? I don't think it is easy to answer it just in the context of the Balkans, because I think it's the manifest weakness of the European Union in general. So, but I don't want to, I mean, it would get us far too deep into how can Europe become more pertinent a player in the world. In the Balkans, it would have to, in my opinion, involve some devising certain methodology for wielding a stick and not just the carrot that is actually kind of not there. The United States, for instance, elevated its significance really in a very significant way in the last year, for instance, when President Biden signed the executive order that would allow the State Department to put people on sanctions, financial sanctions, for basically pretty much anything. It was so defined that you could drive a car through it, you know. Undermining democratic processes, being involved in acts of corruption, inciting ethnic hatred, anything. And after first people started being placed on the sanctions list from various countries of the region, the United States became even more pertinent an actor than it was in the past. I mean, during the Trump years, it was a kind of joke. I mean, the United States was completely not interested in what is going on until the very last month of the Trump presidency, when he came up with this phenomenal idea that he's going to sign a historic deal between Serbia and Kosovo. And there was a circus in the White House with the Serbian president and the prime minister from Pristina, but that wasn't terribly serious. With the new administration, with Biden administration, they approached it a bit more strategically, and putting in the first place a stick, and that made a difference. Now, I know that it is complicated to, you know, have sticks if you're the European Union, because Orban is going to block it to begin with. But some element of hard power has got to be thought through, because in times of geopolitical recessions, you can't rely on soft power exclusively.
We have time for one or two more questions. I think at the back there, yes, there's a.
Hi, my name is Talha. I want to ask a question about
Where are you from?
I'm from Turkey, and I want to ask a question about Turkey and the Balkans. After 2016, Turkey gradually abandoned former Prime Minister Davutoğlu's policies, and now it's normalizing its relations with countries like Israel, Egypt, and the Gulf states. Do you foresee a strict foreign policy change for Balkans as well for Turkey?
Well, I worked very closely with Foreign Minister Davutoğlu at the time. I was Foreign Minister at that time, and those were the times of the zero problems with neighbors, and it was a very, those were the bright days generally of international cooperation, and Turkey was really showing very strong dynamism in re-engaging. That was prior to Syria's war. That wasn't 2016. It was before that. I'm referring to the times when Davutoğlu was foreign minister. But then, as Erdogan and Davutoğlu parted ways, it became, in my opinion, something very different. I mean, I know that there are scholars who claim that it was never different, that Davutoğlu was just like a soft face to this concept of strategic depth that Erdogan has been all about from the beginning in the founding of the AKP party and all that. But I think that by now, the government of Turkey turned into an actor that has to keep elevating stakes all the time, economically, geostrategically, in every way, in order to survive domestically. So I think that the struggle, domestic political struggle in Turkey in the next year and a half, you have elections in 2023, if not earlier, are going to, by and large, drive the foreign policy action. And you could expect some quote unquote bold actions but as a part of a domestic political game. So something controversial, something strong, something something that would make people worry in general with regard to what Turkey does in the Balkans. I can expect that in the next 12 months. I mean, in the period until the elections. And then you know better Turkey than I do who's going to win these elections. Are these elections going to happen at all, and so on and so forth? Then it is going to depend, obviously, on how that plays out. But I mean, this way or that way, Turkey has been a permanent feature of the Balkan politics for the past 500 years, and that's not going to change in her lifetime.
Well, Vuk, thank you so much for being so forthcoming. And thank you to the students and other participants, both here and online, for your questions. I apologize to those that we didn't get round to, but I've tried to filter in most of the questions that we received online. Thanks to Natalie for setting up this session, and to Alessandra. And I think there are so many unanswered questions that we hope we have another opportunity to welcome you back here before long. Thank you. Thank you.